Hi everyone, welcome back. In today's tutorial, I'm going to show you how to paint this sweet and simple floral watercolor wreath. Wreaths are one of my favorite things to paint, so I'm really excited to share this one with you. And we'll paint it together step by step. Let's get started. All of the supplies I'm using in this video are linked down below in the description box, and you can use really anything you'd like to trace your circle for the wreath. I used this roll of masking tape, but you could use a cup, a bowl, the bottom of a candle, or anything else that's circular and in the size of the wreath that you're wanting to paint. Once you have your circle all sketched out, we can get started with the flowers. I'm going to add a mix of some 5 or 6 petal flowers as well as some little roses. And I like to add those first, just because those take up a little more space, and then we can add some leaves and greenery at the end to just kind of fill it up. So I'm going to start with the roses, and I'm going to add a total of 4 roses. And you can really tailor this painting to your liking. So if you want to do more roses or you want to do more flowers, you're more than welcome to do that. So I'm going to start with a couple of roses right next to each other down at the bottom. What I do for this, I have lots of tutorials on how to paint roses, but for these they're going to be super simple. I'm just going to make little tiny C strokes. And C strokes just means it's in the shape of the letter C, so it's just a little curve. And I'm going to leave some white space there. And I'll just go ahead and add a few of these in the shape of a circle, just like that. And now I'm going to rinse off my brush completely. These are going to be very loose, beautiful, soft roses. So we're going to have a lot of color bleeding. So I rinsed off my brush, I have no pigment on there, and I'm just going to gently feather those outer strokes. And you can see that pink pigment just kind of bleeds out and creates soft, fluffy petals. And I'm just going to do that around the edge of this little rose, getting lighter and lighter towards the outer edges. And just kind of making some very soft, loose petals around the outside. This whole painting is going to be very loose style. So now I'm going to do another rose right next to it. It's going to be a little smaller this time, so I will just do a few little C strokes again, starting with a very pigmented mixture of my color and just adding a couple little strokes. I'm not forming the full rose, I'm just forming the center of the rose. Once again, I'll rinse off my brush completely so it's just clean water, and then start to gently soften that out. And I see those bleeds starting to form. So that deep pink pigment is bleeding out into the water that you're adding in the outer strokes. And make sure you're leaving some white space because you don't want it to turn into a blob. The first rose is even a little more blobby than I usually like, but that's okay. Each rose is going to look very different and unique, so you'll just go ahead and continue adding little fluffy petals. Also, as you paint wreaths, it's just kind of a trust the process type of project because we're going to place some floral elements around, but it looks a little wonky until you really start adding the leaves and the greenery and connecting all the elements. So trust the process. Don't give up on your painting even if it looks a little weird at this stage. So I'm just going to add a little more detail here. I don't want it to be too detailed, but just darkening that center a little bit while it's still wet. Now let's add 2 more roses. And I don't want this to look symmetrical. I want it to look like these flowers were just randomly placed along the wreath. So I'm going to add 1 up in this corner. Again, I have a very heavily pigmented mixture of the pink. And I'm just making a few little C curves for the center. I'm not overthinking it. Just making some marks like that, making sure to leave some white space in the center, rinsing off my brush completely, and using those damp bristles to create those very soft petals and feather out the strokes. And that's where you get the nice soft bleeding effect. And that is my favorite part of painting loose style roses like these. So it really, as long as the center of your rose is pretty defined, then the rest you don't really have to worry about. You can just add water around it and it still looks like a nice little dainty rose. So just going back in and adding a little more color in the center, and there you go. The last rose I'm going to add is, let's see, maybe right up in this top right corner. I want to save some room because we're also going to be painting some other flowers. And just a quick note here, as your roses start to dry, the thing with watercolors is it always dries much lighter than when you first apply the paint down on the paper. So as they're drying, if it feels a little too light, you can always go back to tap in more color. But now we can go ahead and add the final rose. Again, it will be the same process. You're getting a lot of good practice, starting with those heavily pigmented C curves. I'm just using the tip of my brush. So it is a size 6 brush, but it has a very pointy tip that I love, and that allows me to still get those pointy, fine tip lines. And then using my clean brush to feather it out a bit. Keep your white space in mind. Again, if you don't have white space, it just turns into a big blob of pink or whatever color you're using. But the white space really gives a little bit of definition to the petals. Again, this is all very loose style, so none of the petals really have a ton of definition, but you do want to maintain a little bit of that white space. All right, so there are the 4 roses, and now I'm going to go ahead and add a few little flowers. I think I'm going to do a bigger one down here, and then maybe a couple more. Now this technique that I'm going to use for the flowers is one that I have taught in several of my other tutorials, so I'll show you how to do it again, but if this technique feels tricky or difficult, you can definitely check out some of those other tutorials to get some more practice. But I have that same color loaded up. You're more than welcome to use other colors if you'd like. I just prefer to stick with a limited color palette. And I'm tapping a couple little dots down there. They're very pigmented. I have lots of water, lots of pigment, and now I'm gonna pull out my petals. So my brush is clean. I'm using the tip to pull out a little of that color from the center and then applying pressure down to create the petals. So I'm just using the color from the very center, and all I have is clean water in my brush to pull out some of that color and create those little petals. So let me show you a little closer up. Okay, so I have that pigment in the middle, clean brush, and I'm just using the very tip to pull out some of that color, and then applying pressure down to create these almond-shaped petals. Rinsing off my brush again, and repeating that same process. So you get these really beautiful, dainty little petals starting to form. Pulling out color, pressing down. And there's our flower. So let's go ahead and do another little flower. I'm going to make it slightly smaller, but again, you want to add some variability to your wreath. You don't want to have a completely symmetrical wreath with all the same shapes and sizes of elements. You want to add a little bit of variety to keep it interesting. So I'm going to go a little smaller here, starting by just tapping down some color with the very tip of my brush, rinsing it off, and then I'm going to create slightly smaller petals here. So using the tip of my brush, and I'm not applying as much pressure, so I can maintain these little dainty petals. And I'm just gonna work my way around this flower, starting with the tip, pulling out some color, and applying a little pressure down to create those petals. Again, if this feels difficult for you, I will definitely link a tutorial up at the top here. That's a very beginner-friendly, step-by-step version of these flowers. So it just takes a little bit of practice. And now we'll add our last flower. I want to make sure it feels relatively balanced. Again, we're not going for symmetry, but because I do have 2 flowers on the right side, I want to make sure I add one on the left as well, using the same exact method. So I create little tiny puddles for the center, and then I rinse off my brush and start painting in those petals. All right, so like I said, this is definitely a trust the process type of project. It looks a little strange at this point, but once we add in the leaves and greenery and start connecting it all together, it will really create a beautiful, vibrant, and full looking wreath. So I'm gonna give these a little bit of time to dry, and then we'll start adding in the leaves. So I also went ahead and swapped out my water because we're using such heavily pigmented pinks and my water was pretty muddy. So I want to make sure I have nice clean water before I start my greens. And I'm going to start with a lighter value of green. So value just means the relative lightness or darkness of a color. A lighter value usually has more water. Darker value is more concentrated. So with watercolor, we're always layering light to dark. So I always start light and then layer darker colors on top. And I'm just going to start adding in some leaves between these elements. And don't feel like you have to make the exact same strokes that I'm making. I want you to feel comfortable and confident adding your own personal touch. So I'm just going to apply some pressure down and lift back up. I'll add another little leaf coming off of the stem. And for the most part, I want to maintain this curvy shape. I don't want any leaves that are sticking directly out of the side. I want it to kind of follow as closely as I can the curves of that initial circle that I traced. So I'll start with that and just kind of work my way around doing this first layer of leaves. They don't all have to face the same direction. I don't need all of my leaves going counterclockwise. So I'm just going to add some bigger leaves going the opposite direction here. And when I add my leaves, I'm just applying pressure, letting my bristles expand out and then lifting back up to get the pointed tip of the leaf. And you also don't want to overcrowd it. We will be doing a second layer of leaves, so don't add too much, but just add some little foliage between the floral elements, starting to just kind of fill it in, and then we'll go back over the top with the second layer. Now on these areas that are a little more crowded, just be mindful of the space. You do want to still have some greenery, but you don't want to overcrowd it. So I'm just kind of filling in some little touches of green. So we're just going to indicate that there's some green underneath the flowers, but you don't need to have the perfect leaf shape to be able to convey that. And make sure you're varying it so you don't want every little leaf stem to look the exact same. Just adding some that maybe have 3 leaves coming off of it, some that are shorter, fatter type of leaves, just giving a little bit of variability. And make sure you take a step back every now and then to see what it's looking like. If one area is looking a little too crowded, then give it a break. And if there's an area that looks a little too sparse, then go ahead and add some more leaves. Just kind of take note of what your wreath needs and go ahead and add it. So you can see I have some leaves that are kind of coming out on the side, but overall the shape is still in the shape of a wreath. Even if you have some petals that are not directly on the line, you're still following that overall circular shape. And I think we're looking pretty good for this first layer. I'm just gonna add a couple more in some areas, but I think we're looking pretty good. Now I'm going to go ahead and let this dry because I want to do a second layer on top, but if I were to just go in and start adding darker greenery on top, while these are still wet, then it would just become a bleeding mess and you wouldn't be able to have defined lines. So I'm going to give it a couple minutes to dry and then we'll add the second layer. All right, so I mixed up a bit of a darker value of green and I'm going to add some little embellishments on top. Some will be on top of what I've already painted and just darkening some of the leaves, and others will be completely new. And one thing I really like to do is just use the tip of my brush and create these little fine tip strokes. So it just helps the painting look a little more full. You can already see adding that second layer, you can see the leaves behind and the leaves on top. So again, just going to work my way around, adding some little leaves to help fill this in a bit. So I'm doing a mix of adding some little leaves and some little wispy strokes. Again, I don't want to overdo it, but I do want to help fill this in a bit. And you also don't want to cover up the entire first layer. You're just kind of complementing what you already have there and making it look a little more full. And at this point, you can really start to see the wreath come together. And again, just make sure you're maintaining the overall shape. Not every single leaf and every single element has to be directly on that circle. You can have some still coming out of the side, but in general, you want to follow that curve. Sometimes for wreath projects, I like to have all the elements either all going clockwise or all counterclockwise, but I also kind of like the wild and free look of having them go every which way. So that is up to you, but I think it just gives it some character when you have these leaves kind of flowing in all directions. So just adding a few embellishments here and there. I'm not overdoing it. We're just helping it look a little more full and lush. And remember to keep balance in mind too. So if you start adding too many on one side and the other side is sparse, it's going to look unbalanced and a little uneasy to look at. But just make sure you're kind of evenly dispersing these little elements. And with wreaths, there's so much you can add. So if you want to add little flower buds or some little berries coming off, you can absolutely do that too. I just wanted this one to be a little more simple and straightforward. And I've said this in some of my other tutorials too, but I have a hard time personally not overworking my pieces. I tend to go a little overboard and not know when to stop. And I think I'm hitting that point right now. So I think that's going to be it. I hope you enjoyed painting alongside me today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and check out some of my other painting tutorials to keep on learning. And I will see you in the next video very soon.